touch on so many things. I'm so glad you brought up the word mobility, because in this 4th edition of the History of Malaysia, and if you look at the 3rd edition, you will see that we say in black and white, we are never going to do this again. but we felt that we were persuaded that what was happening in Malaysia was so important and so pertinent and so needing for greater investigation. We couldn't just leave it in when we stopped in 2014 or so. So much is happening. And I'll try and touch on some of those things, but what we thought would be, we wanted to be the theme of this 4th edition is mobility. So we want to set the whole 4th edition in this theme, and I'm even thinking of the front cover. You know, it could be a picture of Cleo or something with lots of people coming and going and moving, and maybe by the time it comes out it'll be interactive, so you can have a moving cover. But it also brings into question the whole future of the book, because my feeling is that books are, especially for the kind of projects you've been doing, that books are not particularly useful. You know, you have to think of new ways, and I'll try and touch on some of those things, but I wanted just the whole question of national history and nation history. So when people talk about national history, they see the centre, what is holding the book together is the nation, and it's how it developed and what is relevant and so forth. But it always means, of course, that you have to make choices of what you gain, what you think is relevant to the making of the nation. That you can't include everything. My very good friend, the Indonesian historian Taufik Abdullah, said this is very, you know, we've got so many people, not everybody can have a voice on the stage. You just have to make selections. So that is a key factor. And a few years ago, several years ago, Presenter Juar, wrote a book on China called Rescuing History from the Nation. And it had been many years since I read it, but I thought, oh, maybe that's something that I can use. But I went back and read it again, and it doesn't really answer what you want to do, what Malaysia wants to do, because basically he's looking at many parts of it, but he's thinking about how they relate to nationalism. So the nation is still somehow the centre of the whole project, even though he's looking at parts of China and groups in China that may not be included in the nation. So I don't think it's particularly useful to you. However, I mentioned it because it does highlight that it brought, for Chinese historians who are used to a national history, very used to a national history, it really highlighted the need to look at local histories and groups that were not included. But the problem is when these national histories become the history. And if you look at our history, we called it a history of Malaysia, not the history of Malaysia. And we didn't say a national history of Malaysia, it was just a history of Malaysia. So there's plenty of room. Think how many books have been written about the French Revolution. So there's plenty of room for other histories. So there is a need for alternative history. There is a need for a people-oriented history, but how that would be processed and what it would look like, and could it possibly be a traditional book, or is it some other medium, really raises questions. So I wanted to think of just to kind of alert you. So any historian knows you have to see things from other people's perspectives. So let's think, for example, about how states see history, how governments see history. why do they, and all governments, particularly in countries where in nation building, and I have this quote from King Chulalongkorn from the early 20th century, when he called all the historians together in a room, not like this, but called them all together, and he said, we need a history. You have to give us a history that will make everybody love the country, make us all united. That's why history is useful for him as a key. It would bring people together. But even Sujat Moko, great scholar in Indonesia in 1965, so that was a very telling year for the Indonesian. So he said history is an important means of training good citizens and developing love and loyalty for the country. So that's one of the ways that other countries have seen history. But all of you know, of course, about the Historians' Council, which has just been launched this past September. Membership, and I see some very famous names there. So I think that there are very some distinguished historians, and I hope their voices can be heard. But the Prime Minister said he said we're losing, people are not interested in history, which is quite true. People are not reading, that's true. But he sees history, a knowledge of the past, as important to a sense of national identity. And he wants, and I bolded it here, you have to build a strong national narrative. That's what he feels, a strong national narrative. So that's where the problem that Netusha referred to comes in. So what is the national narrative? Well, let's go to the next slide and have a look at, if you look at your neighbours. So Singapore has a national narrative. I think it's quite clear that, of course, they're trying to extend a little bit back before 1819, but basically it's a story of progression, going upwards. A little bit of a dip during the Second World War, but it's a story of progress. Thailand also has a national narrative, particularly hanging around the lack of colonisation. That was due to wise rulers, good kings, and steady modernisation. And Indonesia also has a narrative that hinges around the revolution. That we, through the revolution and through our resistance, our unity, we were able to regain our independence and unite an extraordinarily diverse community of people into one united Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, one united country. So those narratives, I mean, that's very simplified here, but basically in fundamental terms, that's the national narrative of your neighbours. So I'm asking myself, what is the national narrative of Malaysia? And quite frankly, I can't think of a 3-sentence, but maybe you, does anyone have what do you think is the national narrative?
Diversity.
But put it in 3 sentences for me. Like this.
Making it work despite all the problems. Making it work despite all the problems that come with it.
So, Malaysia's national narrative tells the story of dealing with diversity despite its problems and achieving.
And we trundle along.
And trundle along. Well, maybe I could put that in, but but you're not interested. Imagine Malaysia isn't interested in the national narrative, but I think it's there. It's the elephant in the room it's the other that you're kind of trying to compete against. And national narratives we have to give them due credit. They are important. And if you think that most students will leave school at 16 or so, and that's probably all the written history they will ever have. Everything else is gained from the internet, or from friends, or from social media, It's not from teaching or books or anything like that. So what's in the school textbooks is absolutely vital. And I think there's an insufficient connection between people who write books like me, often, and what is transferred from that into the classroom. And often it comes at a very simplified level. And as a former teacher, I taught high school for quite some time, I think people underestimate the minds of students. I think they can deal with multiple interpretations. They're very sophisticated, but they're often presented with a very simplified picture of the past because it's thought that's all they can cope with. And then the exams are built around those simplified questions. And I think simplification is the great enemy, I think. A national history can be alert to multiple perspectives. But Malaysia has in trying to create this kind of national narrative, or counter the national narrative, there's still issues. And we could talk about each of these for quite some time. So, is ethnicity playing too great a part in writing about the past or the present? Is Malaysia's perception of itself dominated by the diversity that really comes down to ethnicities? And I was told yesterday that the Darwin Wilsons in Sabah are now writing their own history in Kadazan. Who reads Kadazan? So there's room for histories that may have to be considered, even if you don't know the language. So I don't think you can get away from ethnicity. I mean, I think it's in the DNA of Malaysia. It's just how you deal with it. And the question that I think many Malaysians ask is how do you work out the relationship between different groups? And I know it's highly controversial, and I know it's discussed many times, so we can, maybe in the Q&A we can talk about that more, but I think now Indonesia overcame it because devices huge diversity. I mean, the difference between Acehnese and people living in Tanimbar or Kai or Ambon is huge, huge. But they've overcome that, A, by the use of one language, and B, by the essential dominance of one religion. 87% are Muslim, of different kinds, of course, but also by suppressing anything that doesn't fit the national narrative. So opposition to the state or challenges to the state are not so common. So yes, so that different diversity can be overcome, and I think Malaysia's most of the time has done a fair enough job, but it's still an issue. And then the second question about, and I feel this very strong. I feel it very. My Malay is not good enough to write a book in Malay. Now with AI, maybe I could just say you do it. I've heard that AI is pretty good. Their Malay is excellent. I've heard. We were over in Pahang last week, and Raja Aziz, Raja Aziz is a great AI fan. And so she had to give a speech, and she had the speech, and she said to her AI or co-pilot or whatever it was, can you make me a shire? Make that speech into a shire. It's a beautiful shire, Malay, classical Malay, everything. She said, now translate it into English. And it did that like in 3 seconds. So there are lots of possibilities ahead. But anyway, language and accessibility. Now, and that's when Professor Abu Talib, the late Professor Abu Talib in Penang wrote a review. He said, that's the great downfall of books written in English, that they're addressed to a certain audience and the average people won't look at them. So the translation project in Indonesia is huge. Books are translated immediately, like Merle Rickliff's History of Indonesia is translated into Indonesia. I mean, everything gets translated very, very, very quickly and quite well done. I think Malaysia's translation industry is quite weak in that regard. I don't think there's nearly enough, because there's an assumption that people could easily read English, and that's not true. I remember one of the translation years ago, of course it's not there now, Richard Story's History of Japan, and the English phrase manhood suffrage, the Americans granted manhood suffrage, just means everybody got the vote, right? It's got no gender, just as manhood suffrage. But the Malay said, untuk laki-laki saja. So, you know, they misunderstood the English. So I think, so that's one thing about the problems of writing in English or presenting the work in English. You're still confining your audience. And of course, with that, and especially being criticism made of our history of Malaysia, insufficient attention to contemporary writing in Malay. And I think that's certainly something that can be rectified, but not everything can be mentioned, of course. So when you mention one book, you don't mention another book, you can find yourself in hot water too. But that's the question of if you're going to write a national or an acceptable history, what language should it be written in? Should it come out first and foremost? What about people who brought up with their first language is with Chinese medium schools, and that's where they learned Malay when they went to Sekolah Kebangsaan later on, but you know, or to their Kedazan friends in Sabah, you know that. So that's another question. And the legacy of colonialism, actually, if you really want to put a hard nose on it, colonialism, 1874, you could say the Pangkor Treaty, that's kind of the formal start. And the British left in 1757, you could say formally, but there's still influence, I know. And of course, influence preceded 1874. But if you think of that, those hard barriers, it's not very long, actually. Not very long. So, the colonial indeed left a huge legacy, but you can't blame them for everything. You know, there's lots of things. It's been now quite a long time that Malaysia's been independent. So I think so what I see, for example, in some of the sites, we have to rebuild national historical narrative on facts, not colonial perspectives. So, what are the colonial perspectives that they want to get rid of? I don't see it in contemporary. Of course, if you're talking about Swettenham or Winstead, or of course you could say colonial, but no modern historian writes like that anymore, or they should be rooted out of talent if they do, but they don't. People like Winstead talked about civilization, bringing modernity and all. Nobody talks like that anymore. So I'm trying to see what are the colonial perspectives that should be discarded, that are still perpetuated in books.
Orang asli rights. Orang asli rights should be rectified. That's something that we inherited, but we should stop blaming the British for that.
Yes, I think that Orang Asli, that's one thing that I'm when we wrote the first history of Malaysia, that was the 1982 edition. So we started in 1978. I had a new baby. We didn't have computers. We had a typewriter in those days. So I hold a baby like this, and I was typing with this hand like that. But I'm very proud of the fact that the first chapter starts off with forest collectors, because we're trying to show right from the beginning that the rise of the Malay world as a focal point of trade depended on these people who went in the jungles and collected camphor and collected rattans and turtles. So, but it's absolutely true that they got really written out of history, as did the sea peoples who were all put on the land. So there are, and indeed, the rights of those people is really something that the modern state should be, you can't, it's not a colonial legacy to that extent, even though the colonials didn't take a lot of interest in it. So I think, yes, I think you're right. But, and then the whole problem of the Borneo states. So if you see anything that has Malaysia on the cover, and you look inside, looking for where is Sabah, and you can't find it, because for most people, Malaysia is a peninsula. And so incidents like the emergency had their great impact on the peninsula, not so much felt, or hardly felt, in Borneo. So there's aspects of the peninsular history that have no or very little marginal relevance. And the opposite holds too. The whole issue of Christianization, of missionary activities is far more prominent in Borneo than it is in the Malay Peninsula. So it's very hard we tried very, very hard to incorporate the Borneo areas, which would include Brunei, of course, as well, into our Malaysian history, but it still looks a little bit like the people on the continent. It's easy to bridge that kind of not only historical gap, but a geographical gap. And then this fifth thing, that Netusha really highlighted in her introduction. So there's a real tension. If you want that national story that everybody will accept and that will help build citizens, how then do we include all these other groups? How many voices can you have on the national stage? Otherwise, and one of my colleagues at University of Malaya said, well, why can't we have a disjointed history? We didn't have to have coherence. We could just have a kind of a mess, really, where everybody can put their 2 cents in. But no publisher would ever publish that. You have to have a coherence, a framework, you have an introduction, working towards a conclusion. So that's a real problem for creating the kind of national narrative that the Prime Minister wants to see happen. Somebody has to make choices about what's going to go in there and how many people are going to hear their voice. Do Eurasians get a voice? Do the Malacca Portuguese get a voice? How many people have an opportunity to express their views? And then that really brings up the last point, is that how oral histories, indigenous histories, there are so many legends, so many stories that exist only verbally, and they've been passed down through human transition, sometimes changed over time. But for the people who keep them alive, that is history. That is history. And the feeling that somehow history is only written is, I think, that something is a view that has to be cast aside in the Malaysian case, because there are so many histories, even in modern times, that are never written down, never recorded. And that's, so when we imagine Malaysia, there's those not only indigenous histories, but knowledge systems. And I had to write something for a book on Perak, and so one of what I wrote about was the early tin mining industry in Perak. And when all these Chinese came in, there were so many in the 1820s, they didn't know the trees, they didn't know the rattans, they didn't know the terrain, they didn't know about the spirits of the soil, they knew nothing. All that they had to learn from the Malays. So they may have known how to build a mine, but they didn't know the protocols that went with it, and they didn't. So there was a real exchange of knowledge, a real exchange of information that I think is often overcame some of what we might see as ethnic tensions. And I think that's so. So the question is, how can we deal with all these issues? I don't have the answers. I really don't have the answers. But I'm just, and I'm just repeating in a way what Netusha said, that ordinary people should be able to relate to their past. They should be able to say, oh yes. So how do we record how a Malay farmer in Kedah in the 1870s reacts to a locust plague? So all his rice crop is wiped out. That's not going to come into the national history. But locust plagues were really a big issue in certain points of time, because so the question of seeing yourself in the past, and to me, I don't understand why so many people find history boring, because it's about people like us. They were just wearing different clothes and speaking a different language, but they were trying to cope with different kinds of things. So we have to try and find some way of making the past familiar to people in the present, even though. So when people 100 years from now read about COVID, so hopefully it will never happen again, the kind of lockdown that people faced, how they dealt with it, but all those memories are really important, because people had different ways. The situation, I know in Singapore in particular, the situation of migrant workers was very different from resident Singaporeans during the COVID period. It was only then discovered the conditions that they were living in and the kind of but people in the future will have other, I'm sure, medical issues. They will be able, if all that is written down, they may be able to relate to that and say, oh, we learned a lot over the last 100 years, we wouldn't be like that now. And so it's actually memories that can keep those stories alive. So probably you know more about it than I do. I've never used oral archives here, but I have used the oral archives in Singapore. They're a marvelous resource of people who remember. In Vietnam, after unification, after 75, all the sanctions cut in, and it was a terrible time. We won the war, but there was nothing to eat, the harvests weren't in, it was a terrible, terrible, terrible time. So the Ethnographic Museum in Hanoi had a special display on that period, on this terrible period. And they gave, that was a long time ago, in the 80s, but they maybe early 90s, but they gave people video cameras and told them just to go out and record what people remember of that time. And so that formed the basis for this new, and speaking of connecting with the present, one of the stories that was collected, you had to have a ticket to get your rice, because the rice was rationed, and you had to line up in these rice distribution places. But the queues were so long. So people would have stones, and they would write their name in the stone, and then they would put it there, and they could go and do something, but their stone would move along through the queue. What they found out, that many people kept their stones because they think one day there might be another rice shortage, and then I would have my stone with them. And when I don't read Vietnamese, but my friend who took us there, we looked at the visitors book, and all the comments were by Vietnamese, and they would say, "I want my children to know about this time. This was a dreadful time." And very shortly after that, the exhibition was closed, and the director of the museum was dismissed. Because it didn't fit the national narrative. It didn't fit the story of triumph, we won the war. It was a story of, I think it was still a good story, resistance, resilience. We had difficult times and we got through it. I think it's good still, but that's not how it was seen. So But keeping those memories alive, in the Vietnamese case, you can transfer it over here. You know, what are the memories of core events like 69? You know, that was really a key event, and there are still people, many people who remember that very well, what happened and what they did, but they've not written it down. But it was such a key development. We came to our first jobs here in 72, so it was shortly after, but I still remember the atmosphere, how it was at that time. And so, you know, these key events need people's memories in, but it's still, for many people, something sensitive. They don't want to be quoted, they want really names. So you need not only memories, but anonymous memories sometimes. And that means they can't be checked. You know, they fail the test of evidence, because you can't ever say, well, I don't believe you. And there's no way of just, but so I've touched on this before, not in my own time, so it took too long, but whose perspectives of leading? So we've already mentioned that Oren Astley. Of course, there's a lot we can say. There's a lot about Oren Astley during the emergency, but after that they tend to fade away. And I think one of the participants in a workshop I went to a few days ago, interesting on national histories, said, well, what the most meaningful thing that she ever did at school was to do a family history, because that really made her aware of where she stood. But that probably happens a lot, but I think those family histories could help people to the past. And I talked before about disjointed histories, and that brings up to the whole question of the published book. We have a long tradition of book production and historical book production. So you start with an introduction, your goal, your purpose, every chapter adds to that purpose, then you have a conclusion at the end, and you said, in this book I have shown that so and so and so and so. But for the kind of people's history that we're talking about, will that work? Probably not. Probably not. So we're entering a new technological age, and already I know Imagine Malaysia and others are using those technological websites and so forth, but the possibilities are endless of presenting, opening spaces for people's memories in a structured, in a space that is open to diversity. But you still have to have some kind of, you can't have everybody just saying what they want. So there has to be some kind of overview. So you could say language has to be polite, you can't, but that means that somebody's still making choices, right, about what goes in. And I just, I'm a historian, even though I teach contemporary subjects, my teaching is all contemporary, but I'm a historian of the 17th and 18th century. So finding people's memories, of course, for that period. So a lot of what we're talking about is really, we can do it now, we can capture memories now, but we can't go back to the 17th century. But we can imagine, and I think the ability to imagine is slowly being dying away, I think, because people have the internet and they have somebody else is doing the imagination for them. So I think, for example, we have to think about when does Malaysian history begin? You have to go back to the Ice Age. Is that the beginning, or when does it all really start? There's a great emphasis on Malacca, and I think there's a lot. Malacca there's no doubt about it, was a very important town for 100 more years. But it's not the only place we've got this about. we've got Pony, whereas Brunei, the Chinese word for Brunei was also, so there are other places as well. It's not the only place. So does Malacca as the root of our national story, should that be questioned? Is it the root?
No.
Or are there many roots? You think of a tree growing and a vast array of roots underneath that are contributing to that. And I think too that you can say, critics of histories that are written can say, why didn't you include that, why didn't you? But you can ask lots and lots of good questions, but you may never find the answers. So I think there has to be some respect for the limitations that historians face in compiling any history, which always takes good work. I talked about encouraging imagination because that means thinking about different environments, and particularly I've been interested in sensory history, the history of how people hear. Now, probably this one you can't read, but from my hotel room I can hear the LRT starting at 5 o'clock in the morning. You know that we can hear. We very rarely hear sounds. I hear them also. But in the past there was a lot more silence, so sounds had greater impact. Thunder had a much greater impact. The sound of a cannon shot. So what cannon shots were used in the 17th century. If you could hear the cannon shot, then you were in the Sultan's territory. If you couldn't hear it, you were beyond his authority. So sound, so when the Spanish came to the Philippines and they said, we're going to move people under the church bells. Doesn't mean that they were going to sit underneath the bells. It was where, if they could hear the church bells, they were in that environment. So I think we could try and imagine what it was like to be in a world where you heard things differently, where the sound had different, and if even the thunder was giving you a cosmic message. It didn't happen accidentally. If there was a lightning strike, it wasn't without purpose. So and that brings me up to in my student, they're not allowed to use the word superstition. Absolutely struck out of their vocabulary. Because what people believe is what they believe. And what they believe is true for them. You have to respect that. You have to respect what people believe. And I think you can teach students to do that. But I do think that the point about coping with diversity also brings up the whole question of one of the great strengths of Malaysia and the Malay world generally has been its capacity to absorb and adapt incoming influences, to localize them, what Homi Bhabha calls vernacular cosmopolitanism. So you can take this cosmopolitan world and make it your own. So you don't have to take everything, you can select, and I think that's been a huge strength in most societies in Southeast Asia that could be much appreciated. So I think my professor always said, history is everyone's business. There's nobody who's excluded from being an historian. Very embracing. So there's lots of room for different but there is still, for professional historians, there's still a question of evidence. Why are you saying that, and do you have, and it doesn't stop you speculating, but I think I believe there should be still some basis for that speculation. But I do feel that the project that Imagined Malaysia is embarked on, this collection of people's histories and people's memories and work lives, even if it seems not very important, it may be exceptionally important for a future generation. And And above all, history is never boring. It's always, we can experience the pulse. We don't need to get in a machine to take us back in time. We have memories, and we have recorded memories to help us do that. So I think that's very exciting. And with that, I think I'll stop now, and I'm sure you'll have some questions.
Thinking about the projects that we've done, and one of it actually was an exhibition at Kawasan Sri Negara. It was called Jalan Merdeka. I said some, so I think how many of you have visited the exhibition? Yeah, okay, that's great. There's some hands in the room. I mean, it was a while ago, but the whole idea, we call it Jalan Merdeka, traversing the routes to independence. The whole, yeah, so the whole idea was that to share like all these different routes to how different groups actually perceive independence in Malaysia. And at the time when we did the project, it was very controversial to even talk about it in that angle. So we had to imagine Malaysia came in and we were like really pushing really hard, and then we had intergenerational conflict during the exhibition, and at the end, it turned out pretty okay. We were successful in telling different stories from like labor unions, the Tamil experience of independence, the Chinese experience of independence, the Sabah and Sarawak experience. To a certain extent, though, I don't think we did it so well. I look back at it, but it was something that we keep working on, and we try to further develop. So that just popped up at the top of my mind when you were sharing just now. And I don't want to take up so much I don't want to be the Yap Center, because there's so many people here, and I'm sure there's so many questions in the room. Anyone would like to, there's a microphone, so if you have any questions, okay. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Ahmad. I'm a PhD student working on Malaysia. Thank you so much for your talk. It's very engaging. I had a question about the word superstition. You said we should remove it from the vocabulary. I assume it's like a modern imposition that we use. But I'm wondering if the work that you've done on Malaysia, or on Malaya, did you come across did you come across people in this history who thought of certain beliefs as superstitions themselves?
Yes. There's a whole, and I don't like to bring up dear old Swetnam again, but he did comment. He saw this several instances of old women being accused of witchcraft, and isolated. So. Yes, I think, you don't even have to look at religious history to see that there are controversies there. And religions also have their own narrative that they want people to subscribe to. And if you deviate from that, it's not necessarily welcomed. So, but yes, if you gave me 3 or 4 minutes, I could think of multiple times when can I go back to the 17th century, is that okay? So those of you who know the whole history will know that in 1699 the Sultan Mahmud was murdered by his murderers. So he was a very nasty man, I have to say. He was sadistic and very cruel. So I did weep for him. But he was also gay. He was also clearly homosexual. He didn't have a wife. So Malays found it difficult to king, because the whole thing about a king, he has to have children, he has to, he exemplifies the fertility of the land. So this guy, who actually shot people in the knees with his but so they invented a wife. They said the reason he has his fairy wife, And she is so jealous, she won't let him have relations with any human woman. So even what we might call superstition sometimes enters into ordinary life as an explanation for the inexplicable. Things that you cannot understand, you can draw on this whole pantheon of spirits and beliefs to help understand why that has happened. So, why do the rains not come? There must be some reason. There must be some reason. Why did it rain over there? I saw Mandu had all these floods over there. Why did they get floods and we didn't? Well, maybe somebody did something wrong over in Mandu, and that's why, for example, incest in the village could bring down really great kind of supernatural punishment. So the question is to find it out who it was. So no, I don't think it's difficult. I mean, the concentration for looking at superstition is usually in the religious environment, and but I think it depends how you classify super. But if you just talk about it as belief in the supernatural or non-human, then I think it's everywhere, and I think we have to be very respectful of that. I've had a couple of experiences in my own life that I cannot explain. I cannot explain by rational means. So I'm very open to the idea of some sort of supernatural intervention that other people might see as suicide. Does that answer what you It's kind of a long explanation.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that very revealing session. My name is Shafiq from the Faculty of Creative Arts, Republic. So it's very interesting because I see, like in one of your slides, you say encourage imagination. Interesting because just recently I've read about memory studies and also history, like how do we distinguish between these two concepts. And as we are entering, encouraging imagination, sort of like moving towards from pure history and then moving towards like between memory and also history. So what I'm trying to get at is that, like in Malaysia, as far my experiences is, what is more practical for the society is cultural memory, which is exists as a form of, for example, rituals, dances, performances, rather than books, because the society doesn't really has that kind of like interest in books. But for performances, dances, that tells about our origin, our way of life, all of that is very engaging, and we would love to, all people from all ages would love to participate in that. But I think what I want to try to get at is that maybe in terms of practicality, the pragmatic part of history is the cultural imagination within the cultural memory, as a form. So maybe the people is actually more interested in cultural memory rather than history, because history you open up a lot of like can of worms. And after that, then you have to, who are you? You are Japanese, you're not really a Malay, a lot of that. All of that. I'm just wondering, what your
No, thank you, Chuck. I think that was a very good point. It was clearly missing in my. But Imagine Malaysia has done very recently songs, right? You did something on the collection of songs.
Well, we were part of a webinar that was about plantation songs.
Yes. So I think many memories, but when you talk about plantation songs, of course, the plantations as we knew them in the past are gone now. We don't. I mean, I driving along and seeing all these soy palm, you can't see any people there at all. Where in the rubber plantations, there used to be lots of folks wandering around and doing things. And but so I think that they catch memories, and most of those are built around something that happened. So they maybe they're about. So there are the songs of plantations, but they have events called up in them. So and there's a reason why they've survived. It's not just a terrific tune, but they still say something to. So I think yes, performances, films, but all those, but they can also, especially films, can also carry. They're loaded. I mean, they can present a very informed and persuasive picture of a particular viewpoint that is misleading and that can actually be harmful in some ways, that can encourage. So I agree with you completely, but it's not an easy matter, why things are remembered, but certainly songs and dances and so on. But again, I can't speak for the Malaysian case, but well, I can. I mean, look at the death of Wyatt, for example. There are reasons why people, it's not really, it's only surviving in certain places or in museum contexts, and so I think there's a good need to keep those things alive. But it also brings, because I worked on Perak, there's a wonderful scene in the Misa Malaya where it's a celebration for the 7th month of pregnancy. I don't know whether people have celebrations for the 7th month of pregnancy, but in the 18th century is a big time because you were well on the way. It was a very good sign that the child was going to be born. You were going to have a miscarriage, and so I think there was a big celebration the 7th month. So this is the princess having a big celebration, and they had the Chinese. They said the Chinese were playing it was really wry, and and the Indians did acrobats, and the Dutch all fired. But the thing they liked the best was a menorah from Kedah. That was what they really, really, really liked. That was so. This kind of mobility of movement between areas, and this was something that Perak people didn't have, and they really liked it. So I think the movement also of how those songs and dances get shifted around is also interesting. Yeah. But yes, it's a very good point, and I should have said something about that. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Johan. You spoke about the tradition of oral history in this part of the world. So can I ask, was Hang Tuah Dongeng? Some historians dismiss Hang Tuah as Dongeng, as there were no written records. So can you tell me?
Well, I'm not going to enter in that that debate. I might find myself on TikTok or something. I think we've run the course with dear old Hang Tuah. All I can say is that in fact Hang Tuah is a great story. It's and maybe it's a terrific story, but it captures, and what it also captures, I think, what you can see in that. If you look in the story, it was Hang Tuah real, and that's not an important thing. I think what the story does is to bring in many of the values or the attitudes of the time. And I remember, for example, so when he goes to the court of Siam, and they say, well, you have to, he said, Malays don't crawl on the ground like the Thais. We wear our kris when we come into the centre. When Hang Tuah goes to India, he can speak everybody's language. He's just terrific at languages. But that was a real value in the early times, that in this multicultural world, somebody who could speak lots of languages had high status because they could speak like Shabanda and so it was a value at that time, and I think it's still valued. People admire somebody who speaks several languages, considered a good thing. So I think if you look at those things, not whether Hang Tuah was real or not, but for the values and attitudes that are exemplified in that story. So does that?
Thank you about that. My name is Rizal. I don't have any professional affiliation in history. I have a friend who's going through a spot of depression,
because he failed his PhD in Singapore. But because his interest is in colonial history, and I think as you go through colonial history, there's a lot of inconveniences in the narratives. For example, in his thesis, he's discussing the idea that Singapore is a global city, and there's a new reconstruction, but according to his thesis was that from the 1900s to until the war, the wealth of Singapore was dependent on the wealth of the Malay states. So it's quite controversial where he's from, but he can't change that in the records. The second thing was his thesis was that the idea that Malay states were a colony. He debunked that because the Malay states had sovereignty. The British never imposed the currency system on the Malay states. It was separated from Singapore. So they had freedom in a rare sense. And the third thing is that I think there's a lot of contemporary historians, and they want to be popular, and they always, in Malaysia especially, they want to show that the Malays were oppressed and all that, and it wasn't there in the records. If anything, the British sort of used the history of the Malay people to their own advantage. So the question would be, if given that he has no future in academic, because his idea is so controversial, are there any other avenues? For example, like I think in Britain it's also not controversial, so there's a Balfour project. I think they're looking at the heritage, the legacy of the Balfour Treaty, which everybody is against. But if you go through history, it's like until the establishment of Israel, the British did expel Jews actually before the war, which everybody forgot. Because everybody is like, whether from the east and west, all insist that the Balfour Treaty was responsible for everything. Whereas if you read the records, it's like it was basically nothing. It was just a piece of paper, because it's really how you affect it. So that's only the only center that you have, the Balfour Project, which is extremely controversial, which nobody really wants to own up to. But is there any other places? Because there is in London, there's the Institute of the Commonwealth, but now it's basically a human rights study organization, but except it doesn't study anything on Gaza, which is very strange. So you have everything about everything wrong around the world, but you don't talk about 60,000 people getting killed. So where can you study colonial history? The legacy is so inconvenient that if you go to academia, you basically cut off, So it's not me, it's just my friend.
I'm not a specialist on Gaza or Palestine. We have someone right here who could probably answer your question. But the whole question of the legacy of colonialism, of course, it all started with Phuket Kim, I guess, was Malaysia truly colonized. So it really depends on how you classify colonization, and I think colonial historians have divided very easily into direct rule and indirect rule, which you also find in India. So there are ways of pulling the strings, and even though the sultans of the Federated Malay States all had residents, they were still allowed authority in the areas of religion and custom. And those are very important areas. Those are very, very significant areas that the British did not try directly to intervene. So I don't see why I think your friend is probably unduly depressed. I think that's a perfectly acceptable point to argue what does colonialism mean. I think to actually say straight out that Malaysia was never colonized, I think that's stretching. Depends a lot on how you understand colonialism. So you could have a lot of, why do they talk about women as the power behind the throne? Because they have a lot of influence in there. So in a sense the British were like that too. And the unfederated Malay states, of course, they're totally different situations. So it's much more complex. I don't think you can, and in the Borneo states you have another situation as well. So I think there are sometimes little incidents of how people perceive change. There's a wonderful quote from Sabah after the North Borneo Trading Company really gets into control of the rivers. So the Penghulu says, when they're under Brunei, he said, oh, you know, when the Sultan said your tax is $2, well, we paid what we could. But when the white man says $2, he means $2 and no more, and no less, you know, that's the change that he saw. So colonialism, and then here's your friend's other issue about the status of Singapore as a global city. Well, I think that's stretching global a bit far for the pre-war period, in my view. But again, when you start using adjectives, you have to think, what does that adjective mean? And it's certainly true that before the war, Singapore's prime source of revenue was as an outlet for goods and products from the Malay Peninsula. That's what hinterland it wasn't, but it had a very hard-working population. And then your third point, the third thing is the...
Well, basically, his point was that the British didn't really, again, it's stretching, he said the word oppress, but basically...
Oh, about the Malays.
The idea that the British sort of used whatever global history, social history...
Well, the British had a condescending attitude towards Malays, I think, but they actually, if you look at all the books where colonials write about Malays, you could see that there was a kind of affection, there. It doesn't mean that they valued other groups hard working in their view, but I think people find victimization can often be a useful tool for getting concessions, and presenting yourself as a victim often generates sympathy. So there can often be a vested interest in doing that or seeing liberation. So I think again you'd have to find different points of view that people actually feel oppressed. We have to remember there weren't very many. When you think Clifford was in charge of Pahang, 25 years old in charge of Pahang, how much influence, how much oppression could he actually exert? Not a great deal. So the colonial arm didn't reach, was very, very distant in a lot of places. So yes, and I think as long as the Sultans were there, it gave the Malays a particular position. So I think oppression is a bit on the east coast of Sumatra, the east coast is along Palembang, Jambi, Indipura, Indragiri, up there. The Malays have felt that they've been marginalised in the Indonesian state, but I wouldn't say victimised.
Hello, Prof. Andaya. My name is Melissa Rani. I work as a writer and I write plays, poetry, and interested in the Malaysian Indian identity. So my question to you is, there are two questions. The first question is, I'm very interested in collecting memories of history, but the people that I'm working with have Alzheimer's. How do I trigger their memories? In the work that you've done when you're interviewing someone, what kind of questions or what kind of stimuli has been effective when you're trying to gather these histories and memories? One. The second question is, there's a lot of information and perspectives now, and when I'm doing this work, I'm trying to check myself and the inherent biases that I have. How do you keep yourself in check and what sort of biases do we need to sort of be aware of, and what kind of questions should I be asking myself before I start asking questions?
It's a very startling second question. Yes, I think that's, you have to know yourself. Yes, everybody has biases, everybody has favourites, everybody has, so I think as long as you're aware of those, I suppose the best way is to have other people look at what you're doing, saying, friendly advice. But does anybody have any ideas about how you check yourself? I think it's just that, it's just like just being reminded that songs and dances had a role to play too. I mean, I think that's the. It's not I'm not biased, but I just didn't include that was a mistake. So, and as far as so you're saying the people that you're trying to talk to are older and.
Yeah, so my friends and I are trying to work with someone who wrote a play in the plantation, during the plantation era. But the person that wrote the play is 90 and he cannot remember the play. But we want to try and get the play from him, so we're trying to get him, we're interviewing him, trying to talk to him, and trying to gather snippets of the play. And so we're trying to conjure memories at this point, and he's the ultimate unreliable narrator, which is exciting in itself. But I was wondering, like, in the work that we've done, like what kind of
Well, I haven't done that kind of interviewing, but I mean, I'm getting old myself, so you have to cut us all some slack. we do forget things, you know. But I suppose that in this particular case, the best thing, to talk to his family, what kind of things do they know that trigger memories of, because people actually, they may lose their short-term memory, but their long-term memory is actually often quite good if they're given the right. But if you can't get it, you can't get it. That's anybody got any suggestions? Dealing with interviewing older people is not always easy. But they all have a story to tell. They usually have a story to tell. It may be not the story you want to hear, but people like to talk about themselves. They do. That's why I'm a lecturer. No, I mean, people. If you ask the right questions, most people are very happy. My husband is a great. He's very good at getting people to talk. And I said, well, what should I? I used to go to cocktail parties or receptions. And I could always feel people looking over their shoulder for somebody more interesting to talk to. And so I said, what do I do? He said, you ask them about themselves. Because people will open up, just ask them what they do, where they came from, so on and so forth, because people like to talk about themselves, and they're often not asked. So that's the only.
No, thank you very much for your time.
Anybody else got any ideas about?
I just saw one kind of it reminds me of one YouTube where I saw I think they were working with people, not sure whether it's dementia in general or maybe Alzheimer's. But it's very interesting because as they play this music, and then just put on the headphones on this particular person, suddenly the mood changed because he's very familiar with the song. Then it becomes like activated. So maybe he wants to elicit some kind of response to try something that is very familiar to his memories.
Something in Tamil maybe, something that the song of the plantation song.
Sounds and smells. The smell of rubber. The smell of rubber is very powerful.
Smell is very powerful.
Yeah.
Yes, my daughter's a medical anthropologist, and she's looking at the loss of smell after COVID. Many people have lost their sense of smell, so they're trying to get it classified as a disability, because it is a disability. You can't smell anymore. So,
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So, hi, my name is Christina, I'm with the Malaysian Cultural Group. You mentioned earlier on the limitation that books have nowadays as an attractive resource, and people seek the information in many ways, and it's difficult for the book to compete with a quick online search or the attractiveness of a video clip or individual testimonial, which takes us into a fragmented and not necessarily representative way of approaching a topic. Have you, I thought you mentioned earlier that you maybe have given some thought as to what could be the future way of doing a book, an interactive book, books that come in translation more easily, because as you rightly said, for instance, history book in Malay, in Bahasa would just break into a much wider potential audience as well.
Yes, no, I only think a lot about the book because I am involved in the University of Hawaii Press, and it does make a lot of books on Southeast Asia. And they, you know, they don't make money, they get a lot of support from the university, but making a book is very, very expensive. It must cost about $37,000 to produce a book. You know, when you pay all the people responsible and so on. So if you take their salaries into consideration. So I think that, and ebooks have opened up a new area, but ebooks are also not cheap to produce. It's quite an expensive operation. So it hasn't lessened it's made it more accessible. So I think librarians, people in academic book production, they're at a bit of a loss now because they don't see a future, the path. All they know is that people are buying fewer books, and that has an impact on what you choose to publish. If you think that, like biographies, you can hardly get a biography published these days in English, unless it's a very, very famous person. So they have to make choices. So I don't have an answer for you because I don't, as my old biology teacher said, I'll be pushing up daisies by the time they reach some sort of solution. I don't have an answer for that. I think electronic technology will take us somewhere. And the problem is that for universities, we're stuck in the groove of published books in writing matter, reviews in writing matter. They have to be in these kinds of journals, and they have to be in this kind of publisher. So all that affects people's lives, and it's becoming outmoded. What about self-publication? It's still a book, but does that count or not count? So the whole publishing world of things is in flux at the moment, and I don't see any clear path. But maybe I haven't heard of it. Anybody else? Anybody in publishing that has?
But do you view this as a threat to our understanding of history?
Good question. Yes, as I think I was saying before, you can talk, you can have a YouTube, you can have some sort of presentation, but it's usually quite compact. You can't, and it's harder verbally to get all the nuances. So if I want to say, well, Malacca has a darker side to its history, like the slave trade, very strong side. If I want to say it, then I'd have to talk about all the good things about it, then people would be overwhelmed. I always say to my students, when you give your presentation, people can remember 5 things. So that's all they can remember. So you have to, what are the 5 things you want them to remember? So what I'm trying to say that it's only in writing, I think, where you can capture the nuances, you can actually explain the complications. It's much harder to do that verbally and have people remember, get it. So I think, yes, I think it is, perhaps threat is too strong a word, but I think it will undermine the presentation of history if we rely totally on verbal or visual communication. I think it will. But I hope I'm wrong.
We have room for one last question, so yeah.
I know master students. when it comes to the title itself towards people histories, the first thing that I come to my mind is about the book of People History of Emeritus, which is Howard Zinn. And how I want to ask the question about when it comes to Malaysia, can people take similar to People History of America towards the history of Malaysia itself? To impose the application of the social history and the cultural history, in which, from my experience, sometimes it's very difficult because, especially when it comes to the colonial time, when we want to get the history from below, there doesn't have the culture of writing, in which we may rely on the oral, but it doesn't give the whole picture of that kind of era, situation, and people at that time.
Yeah.
So, what is your
Yes, well, that you're absolutely right. I think that our ability to capture how the subaltern viewpoint, if you want to use that word, is limited in a sense. So, I mean, I think a people's history, the better title would be A People's History of Contemporary Malaysia, or A People's History of Modern Malaysia, because if you're going to write about what people remember, that's really all you can do. You know, I think you're very limited because, as I said before, you can ask all the right questions. What did these women who were accused of witchcraft in Perak in 1870s? What did they think about that? We don't know. We don't know. And what did the people who accused them think about? We don't know that either. So, so I think it has to be clear where your frame of reference is. And I think if you're talking about living memory, it really has to be, I suppose, post-war. I think that's about as people might be able to remember their parents or their grandparents, but only in small snippets. Does that sound sensible to you? Maybe you could, Netusha, maybe you could finish up with a comment on that question. You know, how far back, how do you actually people's history? What are its limitations?
I think maybe I speak about it from a more personal experience because I tried recollecting some of my the memory of my great grandparents and my grandparents, which was very difficult because one is like having my great grandparents' memories, like I didn't meet them, and you know they really passed on like a very long time ago. So it was like requiring the third generation to remember, because my grandparents were already like memory foggy and like it's like what is this and all that. And sometimes like I think like it's just by luck, to be honest. Like I'll give you an example of a story that was by luck in contingency. There was always this like chatter about how my great grandmother was like in the army or a policewoman or a gangster. Which is like, okay, like, yeah, you know, it sounds weird. So the gangster part was because she had tattoos all over her arms. And say, but she was a cop or something like that. So then one day, this was the story I was told when I was growing up. And then when I became a historian, and one day I was like, maybe I should ask my granddad because it's still a bit lucid. So I sat down with him and I was like, Grandpa, can you tell me if, Netusha, can you tell me if like your mother was a policewoman? Then he's like, huh? No. She wasn't a policewoman. She was in the army, but not Singapore army. Because so this time my family was in Singapore. And then he started describing, she was in like an army, but it was not part of the British, it was not Singaporean. So then it put on my history hat, and then I was like, is it the Azad Hind? Azad Hind? And then he straight away, his eyes just lit up and he's like, yes, Azad Hind. But I can't remember what's it called. I said, was she a Jhansi? Then he said, yes, she was a Jhansi. And I was so shocked because, you know, that was like a huge breakthrough moment for the entire family. It was like, oh, we have this history of resistance and anti-colonial rigor in the family that nobody knew about, and it just happened by accident. So it's like, I think it's a combination of finding that, because like what Melissa Rani said, it's about triggers and whatnot, and putting together it's like the history of gossip and rumors and prompting, and then putting it in the bigger picture that helps. But there's no clear-cut way. Maybe somebody should write a book about it, how I collected all histories of my family in non-conventional ways. But this was just one story I could share that hopefully you might find relatable and you can take away from in your own investigations. Yeah. But otherwise, that's all the time that we have today. I'm so sorry. If you are new, our mission therefore is to empower you, the ordinary Malaysian, to break free from official historical narratives that emphasize the centrality of the state and the nation. The kind of history that we are interested in telling you aren't those found in your conventional sejarah textbooks. We aren't interested in repeating historical facts, regurgitating narratives, or justifying the status quo. Rather, we want to build alternative spaces to openly discuss these narratives, as well as to build the capacity to investigate them, interrogate them, and challenge them. History, after all, is a series of choices, rather than a set of facts. History is a story someone chose to tell in a particular time for a particular audience, responding to a particular context. All historians write history in retrospect. None of us live in the past. We reconstruct them and reimagine them. We imagine how ideas circulate, how people move, how wars happen, how empires rose and fell. And this is why the word imagine is central to what we do. Over the years, we've run workshops, advocacy campaigns, heritage preservation initiatives, public forums, and exhibitions. We have been lucky to receive funding by the European Union, the International Organization for Migration, a UN agency, and the US Embassy to run our projects. Most notable of these was the advocacy campaign mentioned just now, Tanpa Perkawaman. Racial equality is one of the many themes we have addressed. In the past, we also worked on grassroots movements through the History of Student Activism in Malaysia project, and more recently Demo, an oral history project on protests, as well as refugee empowerment through the performing arts. Our latest initiative, Sembang Salon, is a bi-monthly discussion group for Malaysians to explore how history is written and why it matters. Sembang Salon is spearheaded by our program managers who are here today, Brandon and Idris. Shout out to them at the back over there. And it happens at the Malaysia Design Archive, which most of you are probably familiar with. They lead discussions with the Malaysian public based on the critical reading of op-eds, journal articles, and even archival materials. Each of these efforts reflect our commitment to making history accessible and relevant to present social and political concerns. None of these projects would have been successful as they were if not for the opportunity to collaborate with stellar think tanks and CSOs in the country, as well as refugee community organizations